"You have 5 minutes to save this flight," the CEO said, her voice flat and cold across a control room sliding into chaos. Every eye turned toward Connor Reed, a widowed single father in a faded maintenance jacket, still being pulled back by security guards who had caught him inside a restricted corridor. On the main screen, a Boeing carrying 218 souls kept accelerating down the runway, though the braking system showed a locked status. Connor studied the flickering data for one long second, then spoke calmly. "This isn't a mechanical failure. Someone outside is flying that airplane. If you believe an overlooked man can save everyone, follow along and stay with this story until the very end." The morning at Crestview International Airport began under a thin veil of snow, the kind that slowed nothing but made every gate feel more crowded than it should. Thousands of travelers packed the terminals, tired and impatient, after a wave of holiday delays had stacked flights one behind another like dominoes waiting to fall. Announcements echoed through the concourse in a steady, exhausted rhythm, and nobody paid attention to the man in the faded gray jacket kneeling beside a baggage tug near Gate 18. Connor Reed worked with his sleeves pushed up and his hands steady the way he always did, quietly fixing a stalled hydraulic line while the world rushed past him. Coworkers knew him only in fragments, a quiet man who carried an old toolbox everywhere he went and rarely spoke about anything beyond the task in front of him. What they did know was that he could repair equipment the manufacturer had already written off as unsalvageable, coaxing life back into machines that everyone else had given up on. He noticed something that most technicians would have missed entirely: a delay in the ground guidance signal lasting less than a second, repeating with a precision that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Machines failed randomly. This pattern did not. He traced the anomaly further and found it was not confined to the baggage equipment. The same signal brushed against the data network used to relay technical information to aircraft on the tarmac, a network that was never supposed to be touched by anything outside the airport's sealed infrastructure, let alone something moving with this kind of rhythm and intent. Connor reported it immediately to Evelyn Ward, his supervisor. She dismissed the concern, blaming the storm for the interference and telling him, not unkindly, to return to his post. She had 100 other problems demanding her attention that morning, and a technician's hunch about timing patterns ranked low on a list already crowded with delayed departures and frustrated passengers. When he tried to file a formal report through the maintenance terminal, his account had already been locked, as if someone had anticipated the attempt before he made it. At that same moment, Catherine Blake arrived at the airport to personally oversee Meridian 702, a flight carrying a delegation of investors and hundreds of passengers bound for New York. Her presence alone signaled how much weight the company had placed on this single departure. Connor watched from the tarmac as the aircraft was pushed back from its gate, engines humming to life in the cold air. On the handheld analyzer clipped to his belt, the anomalous signal spiked without warning, sharper and more concentrated than anything he had measured that morning. He understood, in the space of a heartbeat, that Meridian 702 was not experiencing routine interference. It was being targeted, and whoever was behind it had timed the attempt to coincide with the busiest, most chaotic morning of the entire season, when confusion would draw the least attention. There was no time to argue his way through a locked account, or wait for someone above him to believe a technician's instincts over a system readout. Connor left the baggage tug where it stood, dropped his tools into the case at his feet, and started walking fast toward the operations building, knowing the badge in his pocket might no longer open a single door he needed. Connor reached the operations wing through a side maintenance corridor, since his badge no longer opened the main entrance. The narrow passage smelled of machine oil and cold metal, a route built for carts and spare parts, not for a man trying to outrun a countdown only he seemed to understand. Inside, an emergency meeting was already underway. Catherine Blake standing at the head of a long table while a dozen executives argued over conflicting data streams. Mason Grant, Vice President of Operations, was speaking when Connor stepped inside. Mason reported a minor sensor fault on Meridian 702's braking system, insisting it remained well within safety tolerances and required no immediate action. Connor cut in before anyone could stop him. He said this was not a sensor fault. A signal was spoofing the aircraft's data feed and had already seized partial control of its communication system. The room turned toward him as if a stranger had wandered into a private conversation. Mason immediately questioned who had let him inside. He reminded everyone that Connor was a ground equipment technician, untrained to interpret flight data and without any authority to draw conclusions about an aircraft in operation. His tone carried the practiced confidence of a man used to being believed simply because of the title on his badge. Catherine asked Connor for proof. He tried to pull up the signal pattern he had recorded, but his locked account blocked him from opening the full report, leaving him with nothing but a verbal description and a handheld device that meant nothing to the executives around him. To people used to trusting polished dashboards and certified reports, a technician's raw instinct carried little weight, no matter how urgent his tone became. Evelyn Ward spoke up, admitting that Connor had sent her a warning earlier that morning, though she quickly added that he often read too much into minor irregularities. Her words did more damage than silence would have. Jackson Cole, head of airport security, ordered 2 guards to escort Connor out of the building. At that exact moment, Captain Amelia Brooks radioed in from the cockpit. Her automated braking display showed 2 contradictory states at once. The cockpit had issued a command to abort, yet the aircraft's onboard systems refused to confirm that the order had ever been received. Meridian 702 began rolling forward on its own, drifting slowly down the taxiway without clear authorization from either the tower or the flight deck. Connor turned back toward the main screen and said the attacker was routing false commands through a hidden maintenance gateway, one buried so deep in the architecture that only someone who understood the original design would recognize it. Mason, his voice sharper now, told the guards to remove Connor immediately, insisting his presence was only adding confusion to an already dangerous situation, a claim that would have sounded reasonable to anyone who had not just watched Connor identify a threat the rest of the room had completely missed. Before the guards pulled him through the doorway, Connor caught one last glimpse of a code string moving across the overhead display, and something in his chest went cold. The structure of that code had been built from a security protocol he had personally designed years earlier for a program he had never expected to see again. Inside the cockpit, Amelia Brooks fought to switch every system to manual control. The throttle responded late, sluggish, and unnatural, while the wheel brakes cycled between working and failing without any pattern she could predict. The aircraft carrying 218 people continued rolling toward an active runway, gathering speed it had no clearance to gather. Another aircraft, a cargo transport, was already on approach to a crossing runway, and if Meridian 702 did not stop within the next few minutes, both aircraft would occupy the same stretch of pavement at the same moment. The tower ordered Amelia to shut down the engines. She complied instantly, but the engines only dropped power for a few seconds before surging back to life, as though something on board refused to accept the command. Amelia repeated the shutdown sequence twice more, each attempt met with the same stubborn override, and for the first time in 15 years of flying, she felt the aircraft slipping entirely out of her hands. Panic spread through the operations room. Senior engineers proposed cutting the airport's entire network connection, but doing so risked severing communication with every aircraft currently approaching Crestview in the storm, a trade of one danger for another that nobody wanted to be responsible for choosing. From the hallway, Connor called out that the attacker was not controlling the engines directly. Instead, false data packets were being fed into the aircraft's computer, convincing it that the pilot's own commands were invalid and should be ignored. Catherine asked him how long he needed to locate the source. He told her they had roughly 5 minutes before Meridian 702 reached the primary runway. She looked around the room at Mason, at Evelyn, at the entire technical staff assembled to handle exactly this kind of emergency. Nobody offered a solution with any certainty behind it. Catherine made her decision. She told Jackson to release Connor, cutting off an objection from Mason before he could even finish raising it. She turned to face him directly in front of the entire operations room and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had 5 minutes to save the flight. Every person who had dismissed him minutes earlier now watched his every move, waiting to see whether the man they had just thrown out could possibly be the only one capable of stopping what was happening. There was no time left for pride, and Catherine understood that better than anyone else in the room. Connor did not move toward the main control station the way everyone expected. Instead, he turned and asked a single question. Who had replaced the backup communication module on Meridian 702 the night before? The room went silent. Screens flickered. Somewhere outside, sirens began to rise in the distance as emergency crews were placed on standby, alerted by the tower to a developing situation on the taxiway. Catherine repeated the question when no one answered. Mason was the only person in the room who would not meet Connor's eyes. He stared instead at the table, his jaw tight, and said nothing at all, while everyone else searched their memory for an answer that clearly should have been simple to give. Connor opened the worn toolbox he had carried in from the tarmac and pulled out a hand-built signal analyzer, a device stitched together from spare parts over years of quiet tinkering. Mason let out a short, dismissive laugh, saying a homemade gadget could never interface with a system worth billions of dollars. Connor said nothing back. He removed the data receiver from a nearby maintenance tablet and wired it directly into his own device, his hands moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact motion 1,000 times before, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Catherine watched him work and realized within seconds that Connor understood the architecture of Meridian Crown's systems more deeply than anyone currently employed by the company. He never paused to check a manual. He never guessed at which port controlled which function. He simply knew, the way a person knows the layout of a house they grew up in, moving through wires and protocols as though the entire system had been built from his own memory rather than someone else's blueprint. He asked Amelia to cycle the communication frequency 3 times in a specific sequence, an order that existed nowhere in standard civilian procedure. Amelia hesitated, glancing toward Catherine for confirmation, since nothing in her training had ever prepared her to follow instructions from a stranger who had walked in off the tarmac. Catherine nodded once, and Amelia followed the instruction exactly as given. Each time the frequency shifted, the false signal lagged for a few seconds before catching up again. Connor explained that whoever was sending the counterfeit commands had to be positioned close to the airport. A signal originating from far away could never track frequency changes that quickly without noticeable delay. Jackson dispatched a team to search the grounds around the terminal for any unfamiliar vehicles or unregistered equipment, radioing checkpoints at every perimeter gate to flag anything out of place. Mason suggested cutting power to the North Maintenance Building entirely. Connor objected immediately, explaining that the North Building housed the only backup server capable of communicating directly with Meridian 702. Cutting it now would sever their last reliable connection to the aircraft. The suggestion itself struck Connor as strange. Mason seemed to understand with unusual precision exactly how the attack was structured, down to which building would do the most damage if silenced. As Connor worked, a small folded card slipped from the bottom of his toolbox and landed near his boot. It held only a short handwritten line reminding him to be home on time. He glanced at it for a single second before setting it aside and returning his full attention to the screen in front of him. Catherine saw the card fall. In that brief moment, she understood that Connor was not risking everything to prove a point or defend his pride. He was doing it because somewhere on that aircraft, and in countless homes across the city, families were waiting for people who simply wanted to come home. Connor isolated a fragment of the attacking signal and found an encrypted signature buried inside it, one he recognized instantly. It belonged to a program called Atlas Gate. Catherine had never heard the name before. Connor offered only a brief explanation. He had once designed the emergency lockout mechanism for that very program long before he ever set foot in Colorado. The countdown on the main display read 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Connor said the only way to regain control now was to trick the attacker into believing the aircraft had already accepted its takeoff clearance. Connor proposed sending a falsified data packet that would convince the attacking system Meridian 702 had already reached takeoff speed and left the ground. Once the intrusion program believed the aircraft was airborne, it would automatically shift into a different control mode, and during that brief transition lasting only a few seconds, Amelia would have a narrow window to disconnect the compromised communication module by hand. The technical staff pushed back immediately. If Connor's calculations were even slightly wrong, the aircraft's computer might interpret the falsified data literally and push the engines to full takeoff thrust instead of granting the pause they needed. One engineer argued that no simulation had ever tested a scenario like this, and that improvising against a hijacked flight system was a gamble no responsible operator should take. Mason argued the plan was reckless beyond reason and insisted Catherine evacuate the operations room, handing control over to federal authorities instead of trusting an untested idea from a man with no clearance to be standing there. Connor pointed out, calmly but firmly, that they no longer had time to wait for outside agencies to arrive and assess the situation from scratch. Catherine asked him directly what the odds of success actually were. Connor answered honestly, just under 60%, assuming the system still matched its original design. If someone had altered the underlying code, no one could predict what might happen next. Catherine looked at the screen, at Meridian 702 closing the distance to the runway threshold with every passing second. She gave the order to proceed. Connor guided Amelia through the sequence, telling her to engage the mechanical brake, shift the secondary control panel into maintenance mode, and wait for his signal before doing anything else. He kept his voice level and unhurried, aware that panic in his tone would only make her hands shake at the exact moment they needed to be steady. In the operations room, Connor began assembling the false data, adjusting altitude, speed, and pressure readings with careful, deliberate keystrokes, each one calculated to be just convincing enough to fool a system built to detect exactly this kind of deception. Mason quietly stepped back toward the exit and pulled out his phone, typing a short message before anyone noticed. Jackson caught the movement from the corner of his eye, but had no time to react before Connor gave the signal to send. The moment the false packet reached the aircraft, the engines of Meridian 702 roared violently, and the plane surged forward with a burst of speed no one in the room had anticipated. The room dissolved into panic. Mason immediately declared loudly enough for everyone to hear that Connor had only made the situation worse. Connor ignored him completely, his eyes locked on the countdown, silently mouthing the seconds as they passed. 1, 2, 3, 4. At the exact instant the transition window opened, he shouted into the radio for Amelia to cut the third circuit breaker behind the captain's seat, the one wired directly into the compromised module. Amelia's hand moved before her mind had fully processed the instruction. The breaker snapped open. For 2 full seconds, the remote control link went dark. Amelia hauled back on the mechanical brake with everything she had. The wheels locked, sending twin trails of white smoke rolling across the pavement as Meridian 702 fought its own momentum, still sliding hard toward the active runway ahead. The incoming cargo transport was ordered into a go-around at the very last possible moment, its pilots pulling up and away just as the situation reached its breaking point. Meridian 702 finally shuddered to a stop, its nose resting only a few meters short of the runway boundary line. For one long, unbroken moment, the entire operations room stood frozen in silence, the only sound the faint hum of monitors and someone's shallow breathing near the back wall. Somewhere outside, a fire truck idled with its lights still turning, ready in case the next few seconds went differently than anyone hoped. The relief lasted only a few seconds. Connor's eyes moved back to the screen and his stomach dropped. The attacker still held a live connection to the aircraft's fuel system. A new command had just been sent. Even though the aircraft had come to a stop, the fuel system display showed pressure rising far beyond normal levels. If the balance valve remained locked in its current position, fuel could begin pooling near an engine that was still dangerously hot from the aborted takeoff attempt, a slow-building risk that could turn a near miss into something far worse within minutes. Connor told Amelia to begin an immediate evacuation through the left side doors, keeping every passenger clear of the right wing entirely, aware that a single spark near a fuel leak could turn a controlled emergency into an uncontrollable one within seconds. Catherine activated the airport's emergency response protocol without hesitation. Fire crews raced toward Meridian 702, while flight attendants guided passengers down the emergency slides in tight, controlled lines, one after another disappearing into the gray morning light. From the operations room window, the scene looked almost calm, a slow river of coats and travel bags flowing away from the aircraft under the watchful eyes of crews standing ready with foam trucks. Connor traced the destructive command back to its origin and confirmed it had been transmitted from a device located inside the North Maintenance Building, the very building Mason had tried to shut down only minutes earlier. Jackson led a small team of officers toward the building at a full run. Mason attempted to slip out of the room, claiming he needed to contact the board of directors immediately. Catherine told him, in a voice that left no room for argument, that he would remain exactly where he was. Connor pulled up the maintenance logs and discovered that the communication module on Meridian 702 had been swapped out the previous night, replaced with a device carrying a falsified identification number. The approval for that replacement bore Mason's name. Mason insisted his digital signature must have been stolen, that someone was clearly trying to frame him for something he had never done. Evelyn, standing near the back of the room, spoke up in a quiet, unsteady voice. She admitted that Mason had personally instructed her, on more than one occasion, to bury Connor's earlier warnings about signal irregularities, all in the name of avoiding costly delays. The pieces finally clicked into place for Connor. Meridian 702 was never truly meant to crash. Whoever orchestrated this only needed a disaster public and terrifying enough to send Meridian Crown's stock price into free fall by the end of the day. Catherine understood with sudden clarity that this entire crisis was tied directly to a company vote scheduled for that very afternoon, one that would determine whether outside investors gained control of the airline. Every board member who had questioned her judgment in recent months would have watched that vote with the morning's headlines fresh in their minds, and Mason had clearly counted on exactly that outcome. Connor moved quickly to neutralize the fuel command, drawing on an old emergency override key he still remembered from his years working on Atlas Gate. The safety display flickered and returned to normal. Fuel pressure dropped back within acceptable limits. But on the screen tracking the intrusion device, a new process had already begun. Every piece of data connected to the attack was being deleted in real time, line by line, as though someone had just realized how close they were to being caught. Connor turned to Catherine, his voice tight with urgency. They had less than a minute to preserve any of the evidence before whoever was behind this vanished without a trace. Connor asked Catherine to sever the operations room's outside internet connection while keeping the internal network fully active. Mason objected loudly, warning that doing so would isolate the entire airport at the worst possible moment, his voice rising with an urgency that felt less like concern and more like fear of what a shutdown might expose. Connor explained calmly that aviation communication ran on a dedicated line entirely separate from that connection, and the only thing an outside link was currently good for was helping someone erase their tracks. Catherine gave the order. The connection went dark. Almost instantly, Mason's phone lost signal, and the deletion process tracking the intrusion froze at 97% complete. Jackson radioed in with an update. His team had located a signal transmitter hidden inside an electrical cabinet in the North Maintenance Building, wedged behind wiring that had not been inspected in months. Beside it sat a temporary access badge, one issued directly through Mason's own office, its edges still clean and unworn. Mason claimed the badge must belong to an unnamed contractor, someone he insisted he barely knew. Connor pulled up the surviving fragments of data and pointed to something undeniable. The transmitter had received its final authorization from a phone currently located inside the operations room itself. Jackson asked everyone present to place their phones on the table. Mason refused, citing executive privacy as though the request were somehow beneath him. Catherine stepped forward and personally demanded he hand it over. When Jackson examined the device, he found an application disguised as an ordinary stock monitoring tool. That same application had just transmitted the deletion command straight to the transmitter Jackson's team had recovered minutes earlier. Mason bolted toward the emergency exit without another word. Jackson caught him before he reached the door. After a brief, tense struggle, 2 officers pinned Mason against the wall and secured him. Even restrained, Mason kept shouting that Connor had planted the evidence himself, that this was nothing more than a twisted act of revenge against the company. He told the room that Connor had once been forced out of a military aviation program following a fatal accident, and that everyone should ask themselves what kind of man truly stood in front of them, his voice cracking now with the desperation of someone who understood exactly how much he had just lost. The accusation landed hard. Several people in the room exchanged uncertain glances, the earlier relief giving way to fresh doubt. A story that painted Connor as a bitter, disgraced outsider fit neatly into the version of him they had believed only an hour before, and old assumptions were far easier to trust than a stranger's sudden heroism. Catherine turned to face Connor, waiting for whatever he might say in response. Connor did not flinch. He admitted in a steady voice that he had indeed left a classified military program years earlier following an accident that had cost a man his life. But the truth behind that accident, he said, was nothing close to what Mason had just described. Years earlier, Connor had served as lead engineer on Atlas Gate, a classified program designed to prevent hostile actors from seizing remote control of military aircraft. It was demanding, secretive work, the kind that consumed entire years of a person's life without ever earning public recognition. During one high-pressure test, Connor's supervisor chose to override a safety warning in order to protect a shrinking deadline. The system failed under conditions it was never meant to face, and a test pilot lost his life as a direct result of that decision, a loss that Connor carried quietly for years afterward, long after the official reports had been filed and closed. Connor had not caused the accident. He had been the one who raised the warning in the first place, and afterward he willingly handed over every piece of evidence requested by federal investigators, even knowing exactly what it would cost him personally. Though he was fully cleared of any wrongdoing, the damage to his reputation proved impossible to undo. Companies that lost lucrative contracts in the fallout quietly blacklisted his name across the industry, and colleagues who once respected him stopped returning his calls, unwilling to be associated with a scandal even from a safe distance. Job opportunities disappeared, and the strain eventually reached into his own home. After his wife passed away from a long illness, Connor left Washington behind entirely. He moved to Colorado and chose a quieter, lower-pressure job, one that would let him focus on raising his daughter without the constant weight of a world built on power and reputation. He had never intended to return to that world again. But the moment he recognized the Atlas Gates signature buried inside the attack on Meridian 702, he understood immediately that something he had built to protect people was now being used as a weapon against them. Catherine realized, listening to him, that Connor had never actually failed at anything years ago. He had sacrificed his entire career simply to tell the truth when it mattered most, choosing honesty over comfort at a cost most people would never have been willing to pay. Evelyn apologized quietly for dismissing his warning earlier that morning. Connor did not blame her. He only said that silence inside the aviation industry could kill people far faster than any mechanical failure ever could, and that the only real fix was a culture willing to listen before disaster forced the issue. Before the room could fully settle into relief, a call came through from federal investigators. Mason had not acted alone. A second command, identical in structure to the one used against Meridian 702, had already been quietly installed on 3 other aircraft belonging to Meridian Crown. The 3 affected aircraft were still parked at separate airports across the country, waiting for their next scheduled flights. If the hidden command activated during any of those departures, the consequences could easily mirror what had almost happened to Meridian 702. Connor used the encrypted signature he had just recovered to build an emergency patch, working with the same quiet focus he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Catherine granted him full access to Meridian Crown's technical network, overriding the company's own legal counsel, who argued strongly against giving an outside technician that level of control. Connor pushed the patch to all 3 aircraft and instructed their ground crews to physically remove the counterfeit communication modules before any of the planes were cleared to depart, working through the checklist with the same unhurried precision he had shown from the very first minute of the crisis. Under questioning, Mason admitted he had accepted payment from an investment group seeking to acquire Meridian Crown at a fraction of its true value once the disaster went public, betting that panic and falling stock prices would force Catherine out long before anyone traced the sabotage back to him. His remaining accomplices were tracked down and taken into custody by federal agents within hours. Every passenger aboard Meridian 702 reached safety. A handful suffered minor scrapes and bruises during the evacuation, but nothing more serious than that, a fact that would later be repeated in every official statement as the one detail that mattered most. Amelia walked into the operations room once her duties were finally complete. She found Connor near the window and shook his hand firmly, telling him that he had done far more than save an aircraft that morning. He had reminded an entire flight crew that they could still trust their own instincts under pressure. The same people who had once looked at Connor as nothing more than a disruption now stepped aside without a word, letting him pass through the room they had tried to keep him out of only hours earlier, their silence saying more than any apology could have. Connor did not celebrate. He simply glanced at the clock on the wall, quietly relieved to realize he might still make it home in time, exactly as he had promised. 3 months later, Mason and his accomplices faced formal charges for sabotaging aviation systems, orchestrating securities fraud, and endangering the lives of hundreds of passengers. The investigation that followed uncovered a trail of shell accounts and encrypted messages stretching back nearly a year, evidence that the plot had been building quietly long before that winter morning. Catherine remained in her position as chief executive, but she publicly acknowledged the culture she had allowed to form beneath her, one where employees felt too afraid to speak up when something looked wrong. In the weeks that followed, she met personally with ground crews, mechanics, and gate staff across every hub the airline operated, listening to complaints that had gone unheard for years. She established a fully independent safety division, giving any employee the authority to halt a flight whenever they identified a credible risk, regardless of their title or rank. Catherine offered Connor the role of Director of Systems Safety at Meridian Crown. He accepted, but only on the condition that his division would operate independently from the board, and that no employee would ever be punished for raising a warning made in good faith. On his first day in the new role, Connor still carried the same worn toolbox he had always used. Catherine asked why he had never replaced it with something newer. Connor told her the old case reminded him that machines never cared what title the person fixing them happened to hold, and neither in the end did the people who were lucky enough to come home safely because of it. Outside the window, Meridian 702 sat fully inspected and ready to return to the sky. This time, before the aircraft ever left its gate, every warning raised by ground staff was heard, weighed, and taken seriously by the people who mattered most. Somewhere across town, in a small house with a porch light already on, a girl waited for her father to come through the door at the hour he had promised, unaware of how close that ordinary promise had come to being broken. Connor's story never made the front page for long, and he never wanted it to. What stayed with the people who lived through that morning was simpler than any headline. A man everyone had overlooked turned out to be the only one steady enough to think clearly when it mattered most. Catherine learned that titles do not make someone trustworthy, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has already survived the exact crisis unfolding in front of everyone else. If this story reminded you that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary calm under pressure, follow along for more stories like this one, and stay close for whatever comes next, because sometimes the person nobody expects is exactly the one you need.